with his voice, controlled at first, steady, defensive, but underneath that careful tone was something raw, something brittle. Then one sentence slipped out, and that was the moment everything cracked. "My kids turned on me," Kody said, not in a soft, reflective way. It came with frustration, bitterness, and the weight of years he thought he could hide behind a camera lens. And the world heard it. Sitting across from Nick Viall on a podcast Kody never should have said yes to, he looked straight ahead and said the words that would tear through his already bruised family. "They've disrespected me. They've disrespected their mother." The clip went viral fast. Not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what so many of his children had already hinted at for years. Silence, favoritism, abandonment, and now a confession on public record. But did he finally say too much? Because this wasn't just another camera crew quietly filming a family dinner. This wasn't Robyn stepping between Kody and the storm outside. This wasn't Christine standing in a kitchen holding in years of quiet resentment. This was Kody, unfiltered, without editing, without TLC's protection. And what followed wasn't silence. It was rage, hurt, accusations, and decades worth of cracks finally splitting wide open. That podcast wasn't just a telling moment. It was personal. For his children. For Janelle. For Christine. For anyone who had waited for an apology and received blame instead. But here's what made it worse. Kody didn't look remorseful. He looked hardened, as if repeating the story out loud somehow absolved him, as if shifting the guilt would undo the memories. What he didn't realize, though, is that his words did exactly what years of family tension couldn't do alone. They unified voices that had long stayed in the background. Because once that clip hit social media, the kids didn't hold back. Garrison's quiet frustration became public grief. Peyton's sarcasm dropped away, replaced by disappointment. The daughters, heartbroken. And for many fans watching this unfold in real time, it was like watching Kody finally say out loud what they already feared, that his children were no longer a priority, only a problem. But how did we get here? And how do you go from celebrating birthdays and building big homes to open resentment on a podcast viewed by millions? Because for years, the fractures were easy to miss. The editing smoothed out the tension. The staged moments blurred the true pain. But now, without the lights and scripted moments, it was all exposed. The blame, the favoritism, the inability to take responsibility. And the problem wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say. There was no accountability, no self-reflection, just this growing sense that loyalty was currency, and love had strings attached. But when you're a father of 18, isn't your first job to be there, even through the anger? Here's where the heartache hits hardest. Some of these children looked up to him with the kind of love that didn't need cameras. They defended him when fans turned. They waited for the calls, the check-ins, the presents. They just wanted a relationship. But now, all they had was a soundbite. Resentful, cold, dismissive. His words didn't patch the pain. They reopened old wounds. Christine once quietly said, "I don't think he knows how much he's losing." And now that loss feels real, tangible. Because this wasn't about parenting disagreements anymore. This was about dignity, about feeling abandoned, about love that started out whole and was slowly chipped away over the years. And the worst part? Kody still doesn't seem to understand how deep it goes. It's not just about who showed up for birthdays or who answered calls. It's that when the family tried to draw a boundary, when they asked for kindness, for fairness, even just simple presence, what they got in return was distance. And now, public blame. This interview wasn't framed as a father trying to rebuild bridges. It was a man defending his pride. And when your children listen to that, when they hear their father list their failures instead of his own regrets, it changes something. It breaks something that's hard to get back. But maybe the most painful question, the one fans keep asking, is this. Does he even miss them? Or has the idea of being right finally replaced the responsibility of being a father? In the next few days, we'll get glimpses of what this fallout really looks like behind the scenes. The posts start appearing. The comments from the kids come quickly, and they don't hold back. This was no longer a quiet drift apart. It was war. And this public confrontation wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment everyone knew. The family they once believed in was gone. Long before the podcast exploded across the internet, before the tweets and posts from the kids poured in, and even before Christine quietly packed her things and left behind decades of broken trust, the cracks were already showing. But they weren't loud. They came in small moments. A missed phone call, an empty seat at a family event, a tight smile from a child who'd stopped hoping. The breakdown didn't start on that podcast. It started long before. Quiet, steady, almost invisible. Until it wasn't. You could see it in the earlier seasons if you knew where to look. The birthdays and holidays that used to be chaotic celebrations started feeling off. One wife would mention that their child hadn't heard from him. Another would sit silently while the camera circled, swallowing frustration like medicine. It wasn't always what was said, it was what was missing. No one wanted to admit it then, but the tension was already there, pulsing beneath the surface. There was one holiday gathering that left fans heartsick. Janelle's boys, usually front and center with warmth and jokes, weren't there. And it wasn't because of logistics, it was emotional. The way Kody reacted when asked about it, short, dismissive, told more than he realized. He wasn't trying to pull them closer, he was drawing a line around himself. And when the pandemic rolled in, that house of cards started falling faster. What was meant to be a time of protection turned into power struggles. Kody imposed rules. Some followed, others questioned. And instead of understanding the fear or the difference in lifestyles between his homes, it turned into a litmus test of loyalty. His children were no longer just kids. They were now symbols of whether the family was with him or not. This was when Gabriel and Garrison stopped just being sons. They became opposites of acceptance in Kody's eyes. They questioned, spoke up, and slowly, emotionally, were pushed away. One of the toughest scenes to watch wasn't filled with yelling, but aching silence. Janelle talking about the boys, trying to explain why they were hurt, and the way her voice cracked. You could feel it. A mother trying to protect them from the coldness of someone who used to be their family's center. You know what made it worse? When Kody stopped showing up physically, but also emotionally. The kind of absence that fills a room more than presence ever could. He started choosing where he felt respected, and avoided where he felt challenged. But when your kids feel abandoned, respect isn't given because of titles or age. It's earned by showing up when it matters. And Christine saw it too, not just as a sister wife, but as a mother. She watched her children slowly give up on waiting for their dad to notice, and it changed her. Not overnight, but slowly through every canceled visit, every passive-aggressive comment about loyalty, every time she had to be both parents at once. Until one day, she looked at the whole picture and whispered what fans had been thinking for years. I deserve more. You could almost track it backward. From the moment the podcast aired, all the way through the episodes where faces were missing from family photos. Him blaming the kids for not reaching out while they quietly grieved the loss of something they didn't know how to ask for anymore. The truth is, Kody didn't break the relationship in one moment. He wore it down over years. A slow erosion of interest, until eventually, his children had to create peace in his absence. And while the show used to be known for its bustle, house building, traveling, shared meals, later seasons felt quieter, tense. Homes felt more like separate islands than pieces of a whole. You could sense the distance without anyone needing to say it out loud. The fans saw what the family didn't want to admit. Time was running out. Not because of age, but because the heart had gone out of the effort. Bonds were fraying, hugs looked forced, conversations were short. Even when the kids were on camera, their expressions held back something heavy. And then came that one gut-wrenching episode, when Gabriel recalled how his father called, for the first time in weeks, only to talk about COVID, not his birthday. His face fell mid-sentence, like the air left the room. No explosion, no yelling, just silence. That was the sound of something breaking, because that's how real fractures happen. They go unnoticed until they snap. The podcast wasn't some sudden disaster. It was the culmination of years of whispers that were ignored, pushback that was punished, empathy that was labeled disloyalty, And once the cameras caught up, it was already too late. Now the question lingers like a shadow behind every clip and every reunion attempt. How do you rebuild when silence has shaped your story more than love ever did? Christine didn't flinch when the words started circling online. Those cold, heavy sentences from the podcast that told the world Kody believed his kids had turned on him. She didn't post a long rant. She didn't react the way some expected. No, Chinese did something quieter, but far more powerful. She stood still, unbothered, unshaken. There was something in the way she carried herself in interviews after that moment, a calm clarity that was impossible to miss. It was the kind of peace that only shows up when you finally stopped waiting for someone to become who they promised to be. And if you'd watched her journey through the last few seasons, you'd understand. Christine has already lived through 1,000 tiny disappointments with him. She's been overlooked in living rooms, dismissed in kitchen conversations, and left unseen in the very marriage she tried to hold up for years. So when he spoke those words, when Kody publicly turned his back on the very children she worked so hard to hold together, it wasn't shocking to her. It was just confirmation. For Christine, it wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It wasn't about fighting to be chosen. It was about freedom. And somehow, in that silence, while the internet exploded with reactions, she looked braver than ever. Her strength didn't come through anger. It came through stillness, through not needing to defend herself anymore. And for anyone paying attention, that kind of strength speaks louder than any podcast. But next to that calm stood heartbreak. Janelle carried it with her like a weight no one else could see. Because where Christine found escape, Janelle was still fighting, still hoping, still stuck in that painful space between loyalty to the man she once trusted and love for the children she watched him alienate. Janelle had every reason to leave years earlier. She felt the shift long before it showed up in edits. But her love for the family kept her tethered. Until it didn't. And when she heard what Kody said on that podcast, it broke something. She didn't scream, she didn't retaliate, but you could see it in her posture. Her eyes barely blinked when she spoke about it on the couch during those interviews. Calm, sure, but you know that look. The kind of hurt that wraps itself so deep inside you, it goes quiet. That was Janelle, sitting still but carrying everything. Because those weren't just words Kody threw out. They were indictments. Judgments aimed straight at the children they raised together. And to hear someone you shared a life with, a home, a faith, a promise, reduce those children to disrespectful and disloyal, it did more than create tension. It drained something permanent. The scene where Janelle quietly pushed back on Kody's perspective about the boys, trying to explain that they felt abandoned, unsafe, dismissed, wasn't just a disagreement. That was a mother drawing a line in the sand. And it wasn't because she wanted to win, it was because she could feel her sons slipping through the cracks, and there was no one else left defending them. That's the difference between Christine and Janelle right now. Christine has made peace. She knows who she is without him. She's started over, moved out, rebuilt her life with her kids without bitterness. And when Kody speaks from that place of anger or pride, Christine sees right through it. There's no emotion left there for her, only history. But Janelle, she's still grieving the version of him she used to believe in. Every interview, every spotlight moment post-podcast, you can feel it in her tone. She's not mad, she's hurt, really hurt. And hurt like that has no timeline. And when Janelle said, "He's not the man I thought he was," that wasn't shock talking. That was mourning. So as the world replayed the podcast over and over, watching Kody double down on blame, finger-pointing, and frustration, Christine watched from a safe distance. Janelle watched from the middle of the storm. Christine's strength came from walking away. Janelle's heartbreak came from staying too long. And when fans watched those couch talks, those quiet scenes, those confessionals, many could feel it. This wasn't about marriage anymore. It was about a man who left emotionally years ago, and two women who were finally strong enough to say, no more. So the question now isn't who's right or wrong, it's this. When the story you've built your whole life around starts to collapse, what do you save? Christine chose herself. Janelle's still trying to figure out if there's anything left to hold on to. When the kids finally spoke, the sound wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was measured, steady, and devastating. But the silence that came before it, that's what made their words hit harder. For years, the adult children of this family stayed quiet. You'd see glimpses of discomfort in certain scenes, brief side glances during family gatherings, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, but few said anything openly. They weren't the ones with the cameras in their faces every week. They didn't do interviews. They didn't rant. They watched. They waited. And they absorbed everything. But then came that moment, after the podcast. After their father sat across from a stranger and, without warning, accused his own kids of disloyalty and disrespect on record. That was the moment things shifted. Suddenly, the silence these kids had carried for so long became impossible to hold. And when they broke it, they didn't yell or exaggerate. They told the truth. And that truth was heavier than anything he accused them of. Garrison, usually so private, made a rare post. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't name-call, but in his words, there was something worse than anger. Disappointment. You could tell he had reached his limit. The sadness in his expression, the bite in his tone. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was trying to protect the version of himself that once believed in his dad. Because Garrison wasn't just hurt by the podcast, he felt openly discarded by a man he'd once looked up to. And then there's Gabriel. That scene. The one that fans still talk about, where he sits across from producers and recalls how his father remembered COVID protocols, but forgot his birthday. His voice cracks. His face drops. He swallows his pain mid-sentence. And that's what stayed with people. Not the words, but the moment you realize this young man had been pushed aside so many times that even something as small as a phone call had become a lifeline he didn't get. He didn't scream. He didn't blame. He just told the truth. And the truth was undeniable. They were grieving someone who was still alive. Payton, on the other hand, handled it with a mix of sarcasm and honesty. But beneath that thin layer of humor, you could feel the cut. When he made public comments reacting to Kody's podcast statements, it wasn't just content. It was a wound. His relationship with his father had always been complicated, marked by moments of emotional distance even before the breakup with Christine. But this felt like confirmation that the emotionally distant man Payton had struggled to understand wasn't going to change. And while some took Payton's jabs lightly, the people really listening caught the deeper meaning. He was done hoping for something that was never going to come. And then there were the daughters. Not always on camera, not always vocal, but when they spoke, on TikTok, in reposted comment screenshots, you could hear the same thread running through it. Not rage, not fury, but grief. Some didn't bother with long posts or statements. They simply unfollowed, or liked a comment that revealed more than words ever could. And it was enough to tell the world everything they needed to know about how they felt. Each reaction was different, but the theme was the same. They were done waiting. What hurts more than being cut off is realizing the person holding the scissors never noticed what they were doing. And that's exactly how so many of these kids were treated. Like they were expected to carry all the emotional labor. Check in, stay sweet, be loyal, show up. And when they stopped pretending everything was fine, they were labeled ungrateful. But those weren't rebellious teens. These were adults, some with their own kids, some painfully aware of what respect and love are supposed to look like. And for them, hearing their father speak on that podcast as if they were the problem, it wasn't surprising. It was confirming. And fans paid attention, not because the kids had some big planned media moment, but because the stillness they had upheld for so long was finally breaking, and that sound, their voices finally rising, carried more emotional weight than anything ever edited for TV. What they wanted wasn't outrage. What they wanted was to be seen. When you listen to those moments, when you hear Garrison trying to explain why he distanced himself, when you see Gabriel retreating emotionally the way only a heartbroken son can, you start to understand. This isn't a storyline. It's the quiet sorrow of kids who just wanted their dad to show up, not speak about them on podcasts, but speak to them in real life. And that's why their words mattered. Because they weren't trying to destroy him. They were trying to reclaim what little pieces of themselves were left after spending years believing they were the cause of a problem they never created. They weren't calling for attention. They were calling for peace. And the saddest part? They said more in a few posts than their dad ever said to them on camera. Robyn's tears used to mean something different. In earlier seasons, they were a symbol of vulnerability, an emotional compass in a family that preferred to gloss over pain with forced smiles and awkward group hugs. But now, those tears fall heavier. They come from a place that feels stuck, because while Kody's public comments sparked anger and sadness across the family, Robyn's reaction wasn't rage. It wasn't even surprise. It was desperation. A final, aching plea to hold on to a family that no longer exists. You can hear it in her voice, the way she still says "we" when the rest of the wives stopped using that word a long time ago. She talks about family unity like it's a personal mission and carries the weight of everyone else's decisions on her back, as if their crumbling relationships reflect some failure on her part. Robyn didn't defend the podcast comments exactly, but she didn't speak against them either. And in that middle ground, where emotion clouded reason, it became clear she was still trying to fix something she didn't break. She cried about the children not coming around, about the split between the wives, about how much it hurt to be labeled the favorite. But in all that emotion, something was missing. Accountability. Not for what Kody said, but for what she enabled. For sitting beside him while he alienated others. For whispering peace while standing silently through war. It wasn't malice. It was fear. Fear of watching the life she built slip out from under her, one estranged child at a time. And then there's Meri. But Meri didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't write long Instagram paragraphs or show up in interviews with teary eyes and quivering hands. No, Meri did something quieter. Something that spoke louder than words ever could. She vanished. Little by little, she slipped out of the emotional narrative, still present in form, but not in spirit. You could see it happening in real time, the way she started to speak in past tense about Kody, the way her laughter became more genuine only when he wasn't in the scene, the way her voice steadied when talking about life outside the family. She was detaching not out of rage, but out of survival, because Meri had already been emotionally alone for years before the podcast. She sat through rejection after rejection, waiting for a spark that never reignited. And when she watched Kody place blame onto the children, there wasn't shock on her face. There was something else. Recognition. She knew exactly how it felt to be on the other side of his disappointment. To be called out in public. Dismissed. Shamed quietly. Meri's silence in response to that podcast wasn't indifference. It was exhaustion. And in that exhaustion grew a truth many fans noticed. She didn't belong in that narrative anymore. Not because she didn't care, but because she couldn't keep caring without destroying what was left of herself. Robyn and Meri were on two different ends of the emotional spectrum, but both were sinking. Robyn couldn't let go of the ideal. Meri couldn't keep pretending it was still worth chasing. And between them stood a man who wasn't holding anyone together anymore. The most painful scenes weren't the explosive ones. They were the quiet dinners where Robyn sat alone at the table, place settings untouched, waiting for a family that wouldn't come. Or the moments where Meri walked through a room unnoticed. No longer angry, only numb. And fans felt it. You could sense the emotional instability. Nothing felt grounded anymore. Not the relationships, not the beliefs, not even the show itself. Every episode started feeling like a countdown towards something final, something irreversible. Robyn kept saying she wanted peace, but peace can't be forced when trust is shattered. And Meri stopped asking for love the moment she realized her presence had become a placeholder. That's what makes this chapter so hard to watch, not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest. Two women standing in the ruins of a dream once shared, now holding on in completely different ways. One with open hands, still pleading. The other with her bags already packed. In every way but physical. Holidays used to mean something in the Brown family. Despite the tensions, despite the jealousy and the shifting dynamics, those moments were sacred. The kids would gather, the wives would cook, decorations would fill every room, and for a few hours, it looked like maybe, just maybe, they could still pretend it was all working. But somewhere along the way, even those fragile attempts fell apart. What was once the glue holding everyone together became another source of dread. And as the years passed, the holidays became the setting for the final unraveling. It started with something simple: disagreements over pandemic rules. Kody demanded strict protocols. Temperature checks, no socializing outside the household, strict lockdowns. Janelle's sons, especially Garrison and Gabriel, didn't agree. They were adults, already working, already living with their own ideas about life. And instead of finding compromise, Kody made it clear: obey or be excluded. It wasn't said in those words, but it didn't have to be. The message was felt. And for the first time, his sons stood up and said no. They wouldn't trade their autonomy for a seat at a dinner table loaded with tension. Thanksgiving that year hit hard. Christine had already started slipping away emotionally, and the boys, once lively forces in every family scene, were missing entirely. Janelle told Kody they wouldn't be there. He didn't ask why. He didn't try to fix it. He walked away, already settled in his version of the story. That disobedience was betrayal. That missing a meal was disrespect. That boundaries, when they weren't his, didn't matter. Christmas followed, and you could feel the shift. The kids who used to run around with laughter now booked separate plans. There were no big group hugs, no chaotic gift opening in a full room, just factory line-style visits. Small pockets of connection, only where it was still safe. And for the rest, distance. Janelle tried to soften the blow. She reasoned. She reminded Kody that the boys loved him, that this wasn't about rebellion, it was about feeling heard. But his heart seemed armored by resentment. He wanted apologies, submission, respect on demand. But what about the respect a father owes his sons? The emotional burden sat heavier than ever that year. And Christine, free now from having to make excuses, invited some of the kids to her own home. The laughter there was different, lighter, because the absence of control created space for joy. And whether the show aired those scenes or left them on the cutting room floor, everyone could see it in the interviews. Divided holidays were now the norm. Gatherings were no longer reunions, they were risks. And when Kody talked about it, he didn't sound sad. He sounded indignant. He blamed the wives for not pushing the kids harder. He didn't ask what created the silence, he punished it. He acted wounded, not because they were gone, but because they chose not to bend for him. That's what made it all so volatile. This wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about one holiday gathering, it was about power. About whether love could survive under a command. There was one scene that captured it painfully clear. Janelle, sitting in her living room, explaining to the camera that she didn't even know what to do anymore. How do you plan a holiday when the father of your children demands conditions that break them? How do you tell your sons they'll be welcome at dinner only if they pretend not to be hurt anymore? She looked tired. Tired in a way that goes past physical. Tired in her soul. And Robyn? She still set the table. She still waited. Still called it a tragedy that the family wasn't together. But even her tears couldn't rewrite the fact that none of them wanted to come around a man who pushed them away and then cried about being left behind. That's the fracture that changed it all. Not the split between the wives, not the bitterness between households, but the broken line between a father and his children. Relationships that used to rise above the marital chaos, but now sat beneath it, crushed by expectations no one could meet. By the time the second failed holiday rolled around, nothing felt repairable. Plans were made separately. Some kids didn't even check in. And the uncomfortable truth became impossible to deny. Even the most loyal family members had their limits. This wasn't just a rift between parents, this was a turning point. A reminder that no matter how deep the faith, how big the plural family, or how long the shared history, respect isn't automatic. It must be given. It must be nurtured. And once it's gone, no holiday, no apology, no gift can make people forget the pain of being seen as obstacles in a house that once called them blessings. And when Kody looked around and realized he couldn't bring them back under one roof, he didn't ask how they felt. He asked why they weren't loyal. Kody said they turned on him, that his children turned cold, distant, even disrespectful. He repeated it in the podcast, in interviews, and face-to-face with the wives. He told the world he no longer felt love coming from his kids, that they didn't listen, that they rebelled. But when you look closely, not at the words, but at the patterns, you begin to see the weight of a harder truth. Maybe they didn't turn on him. Maybe he turned away first. Because love doesn't vanish like that. It doesn't flip off like a switch just because teenagers grow up or challenge your rules. It fades slowly, over time, when absence is louder than presence, when unexplained distances become more normal than connection, when a child calls and no one answers. That's what you begin to realize going back through those episodes. His pain might be real, but it's positioned like a spotlight, always pointed back at him. During one of the podcast's most uncomfortable moments, Kody said, "My children have betrayed me." His voice held frustration. His eyes burned with disbelief, like he couldn't understand how things got to this point. But instead of asking why they felt disconnected, why they stopped talking, why the room changed when he entered, his focus stayed steady. Everything wrong was something done to him, not something he caused. But if you've watched this family long enough, you know. Those kids didn't stop showing up for no reason. Garrison stopped reaching out, not because he didn't love his father, but because every conversation became tension. Gabriel stopped smiling during filming once it was clear that warmth only flowed in one direction. And the pain wasn't hidden. It was written all over their faces. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from teenage rebellion. It comes from emotional neglect. No one's saying fatherhood is easy. Kody had 18 children spread across several homes, with emotions swinging from every direction. It was going to be messy, but responsibility doesn't vanish just because it's difficult. And what stung the most for viewers was the way he described his relationship, or lack of one, with his children. He didn't sound like someone grieving connection. He sounded betrayed, defeated, but inflexible. And that posture, that need to be right over being present, it cost him. There's one season, just before Christine leaves, where Kody admits he doesn't feel safe around some of his kids anymore. He says they talk back, that they disrespect the rules. And Christine, stunned, looks at him and says, "They're hurt. They're not angry. They just want their dad." But by then, he wasn't listening. He was building walls. Emotional walls dressed up as boundaries. He calls it betrayal. But what happens when kids try, again and again, and get nothing in return but lectures? What happens when your children text you and months go by with silence? It's not betrayal. It's heartbreak. Even Janelle, who tried for so long to bridge the space, finally said it out loud. He's acting like they're enemies. They're his sons. And that's when the narrative began to crack. Because for all the pain Kody talks about, for all the tears and frustration, it's hard to overlook how one-sided it's become. He says they turned on him, but where was he when Gabe was crying in that chair over a forgotten birthday? Where was he when his daughters posted cryptic comments online about emotional absence? Where was the repair after all the rules turned into conditions and connection became transactional? No child should have to earn love, and yet that's what it began to feel like. Kody's presence went only to the people who aligned, who followed, who didn't push back. And somewhere deep in his mind, that might have seemed like control. But to the people who loved him most, it looked like conditional affection. So when Kody told millions that his kids had turned on him, some fans paused, not because it sounded surprising, but because, for the first time, they realized maybe he had no idea how far he'd already stepped away. Maybe, when he looked around and saw no one standing beside him, it wasn't about rebellion. Maybe it was about the silence that followed years of unanswered questions, missed moments, and love that became performance instead of comfort. It didn't take long. The moment the podcast clip hit the internet, Kody talking about betrayal, about his own children turning on him, viewers were already pausing, rewinding, and shaking their heads. And before the week ended, the backlash began. TikToks were everywhere. Twitter exploded. Reddit lit up like wildfire. But this time, it wasn't just casual gossip or fan debates. It was personal for the people watching. Because what they saw wasn't distant reality TV drama anymore. They saw a father missing the point again and again, while his family emotionally drifted off screen. On TikTok, users stitched together edits of Kody's podcast words with heartbreaking clips of Gabriel crying, Christine walking out, and Janelle gripping her emotions through gritted teeth. One video rang through the algorithm like a warning bell. This wasn't a surprise. We watched him push them away season after season. Millions saw it. Thousands commented. It resonated because fans weren't seeing things through edited lenses anymore. They were connecting the dots themselves. Reddit, where long threads have followed the family since season 1, erupted with commentary that pulled no punches. One user wrote, "He's not betrayed, he's exposed." Another went further. "The kids are done emotionally laboring for a man who thinks loyalty is obedience." And as brutal as that read, you couldn't deny it felt earned. For years, fans had watched the divide grow, while Kody stayed centered in his version of the truth. But now, the truth had cracked open. Twitter became a timeline of receipts. Viewers started posting side-by-side screenshots, Kody crying about being lonely, next to flashbacks of him walking out on conversations, raising his voice at Janelle, or ignoring Christine's tears. The contrast was sharp, and the tone had shifted. Sympathy was gone. Empathy was gone. Fans weren't confused anymore. They were frustrated. Because the message that kept echoing across every post, every stitch, every thread was this: he could have changed. He chose not to. One of the most viral reactions? A TikTok that simply said, "You abandoned them, and now you're mad they learned how to live without you?" It was a 15-second video, followed by images of the kids smiling in their own lives, with Christine starting over and Janelle alone but free. That clip touched something deep for viewers. Not because it was clever, but because it was honest. And it wasn't just about Kody. It was about every viewer who saw their own story in what the Brown kids were going through. Adult children who knew the sting of being blamed for the distance they didn't create. Mothers who had stayed too long, hoping someone would change. Siblings who carried the emotional burden of keeping a family together when no one else was trying. Fans made their voices heard louder than ever. The comments under almost every Sister Wives post became unified. Not in hate, but in truth. "We've watched you change, and it's not the kids who gave up." Some called him manipulative. Some called him delusional. But most just looked stunned that even now, he doesn't see how his words are cutting into scars his family's already been forced to wear in silence. Even Robyn's tearful pleas didn't earn the same response they used to. A popular Reddit comment put it best: "When she cries now, all I hear is guilt, not grief." The sentiment wasn't cruel, it was just exhausted. Viewers had been asked to believe in this family for nearly 2 decades. And now, they felt like they were watching the truth finally catch up on screen. The shift in public opinion wasn't about taking sides. It was about seeing patterns. And when you watch someone repeatedly deflect, dismiss, and deny, while his children beg, walk away, or emotionally check out, you stop waiting for clarity. You start accepting what's already there. So when the podcast aired and Kody painted himself as the victim, fans weren't shocked. They were done. Done waiting for self-awareness that never arrived. Done hoping for emotional accountability that never came. Done pretending this was still a plural family, when the reality now looked like one man, one wife, and a trail of broken bonds he refuses to acknowledge. And maybe that's what makes this so hard to watch now. Not because of the drama, but because so many people watching understand exactly how it feels to be unheard in a family that once promised love without condition. And they'll keep watching, not for the reunion, but to make sure the people who fought to break free from that silence find peace on the other side. Silence now fills the spaces where laughter used to live. Not dramatic silence, not heavy with confrontation. It's the kind that lingers when too many things were said too late, when calls go unanswered, when birthdays become reminders instead of celebrations, when time slips past, and the longer the distance grows, the harder it is to turn around. That's where the Browns are now, not in the middle of a storm, but in the messy, fragile aftermath. You can see it in the interviews. Christine doesn't ask about the other kids often, not because she doesn't care, but because she knows forcing it will only reopen wounds. She's focused on healing, on building a home full of safety, not tension. Her smiles now look real, but there's still weight in her voice every time the subject shifts back to what they left behind. Janelle speaks slower now. There's still strength, but It's mixed with a kind of exhaustion that only long-term emotional disappointment can create. She's no longer trying to fix every torn bond. She's choosing her energy carefully, protecting what's left, mainly her kids and her own peace. And maybe that's progress, but it's also grief. Because even if these women have walked away from the marriage, they haven't walked away from the reality that these children still carry the weight of that past. So what happens now? Is there a future where Kody sits at a table with Gabriel and Garrison and actually hears them? Can a man who felt betrayed by boundaries learn that relationships don't survive by control, but by presence? That's hard to say. Every time Kody speaks, it still sounds like defense. He speaks about trust like it's something taken from him, instead of something he broke. He talks about his kids in the third person. Rarely, my son said, or my daughter feels. More often it's they or them. And that language matters. It matters because healing doesn't happen in generalizations. It happens in showing up, in doing the work, in rebuilding slowly without expecting immediate applause for effort that should have always been there. But not all hope is gone. In a quiet moment, there was a scene where Janelle said something that stuck. She said, "I think reconciliation could happen, but it has to start from a real place." That wasn't wishful thinking. It was clarity. Because for Janelle, the door isn't slammed shut, but she refuses to let it swing open again without change. Real change. Some of the kids, too, have shown they're not holding their pain with hate. They're not burning bridges. They're walking away from the fire. And if anything is going to soften the edges of this family's sharp divide, it might start there. Not in loud apologies, not in family therapy episodes, but in small moments. Eye contact, phone calls, unseen visits off camera. That's what makes this chapter so heavy. There's no neat ending. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the truth is, some families don't go back. Some rebuild new versions on different ground. Some love each other from across states, across boundaries, without ever finding their way back into the same house again. And that doesn't make it a failure. That makes it real. Still, there's a part of every viewer, whether they've been watching since season 1 or found themselves pulled into the story recently, that quietly wonders, could they still make it right? If Kody picked up the phone, if he showed up unannounced, not to give a speech or list expectations, but to simply say, "I miss you," would it matter? Or has too much been said? Too much lost? That question hangs in the air like unfinished business. Because despite everything, despite the pain and the distance, and the reality that some wounds won't heal perfectly, there's still love under all of this. Broken, complicated, but not fake. And love like that doesn't always need fixing. Sometimes it just needs to be seen, acknowledged, held, even if only for a moment. The truth is, healing doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes healing looks like clarity, like finally speaking the truth, even if it doesn't bring everyone back together. But wouldn't it be something if he understood now what his children wanted all along? Not perfection, not control, just their father. Present, honest, human. There's a stillness around the family now that wasn't there before. Not the kind that comes with peace, but the hollow kind that follows emotional wreckage. You look at the newer episodes, the recent interviews, clips shared online, and that once chaotic energy, kids talking over each other, wives passing dishes, Kody in the middle trying to mediate or control, is gone. What remains is space. Too much of it. Not just physical distance, but emotional miles that no one seems ready to cross. The podcast didn't break the family. It didn't even make new wounds. It exposed the ones that were never treated in the first place. And in the aftermath, while some are moving forward, others are still trying to figure out what fragments can be salvaged, if anything. But for the father who's at the center of it all, healing would require something much harder than words. It would require humility. It would require him to stop justifying and start listening. So far, that hasn't happened. Kody still clings to his narrative, one where he was ambushed, disrespected, and left behind. He holds tight to that version of the story like it protects him from looking deeper, and you can feel how much it defines his presence now. Not as a father trying to reconnect, but a man shielding himself from accountability. But he's not the only one feeling the weight. Some of the kids, despite everything, haven't shut the door completely. You can see it in quiet moments, when their voices soften while talking about him, when they try to explain the hurt without cutting him down. It's not hatred they're holding on to. It's the memory of who he used to be, or maybe who they hoped he could become. And that, more than anything, is what makes this so emotionally complex. Because when a parent wounds a child, the reaction isn't always rage. Sometimes it's grief, a loss that plays out while the person is still alive. A kind of mourning not everyone understands. You can watch someone move on, live a full life, smile for the camera, and still carry scars invisible to everyone else. So how does that get repaired? Is that kind of healing even possible? Rebuilding trust isn't about one phone call or a camera-ready apology. It's about showing up when the cameras are gone. About saying, "I was wrong," with no follow-up defense. About re-earning the right to be let back in, step by slow step, on their terms, not his. But so far, we haven't seen those steps. Instead, we've seen more retreats, more distance, more retreating into comfort zones. Robyn still holding on to what's left. Janelle being honest but weary. Christine completely out, trying not to look back. And the kids, some visible on social media, others gone silent, dealing with their father's words in real time, in real pain. There was one moment, subtle but powerful. One of the daughters posted a message about boundaries, not calling anyone out, but clearly addressing something deeper. About not mistaking silence for peace. About not forcing reconciliation before there's change. And that message stuck, because it mirrored what this entire family dynamic has become. Not a war, but an emotional standoff without movement. That's not to say all connection is lost. There are still glimmers. Peyton cracking jokes about the mess, but occasionally revealing longing beneath the sarcasm. Gwendolyn expressing complex layers of reflection and kindness, even as she steps firmly away. And deep in her voice, Christine has made it clear that despite the damage, she still wants the best for everyone, including Kody. But even wanting the best for someone doesn't mean letting them back in. Healing, if it ever comes, won't be a scene on the show. It won't be posted to an Instagram caption with a family selfie and a vague hashtag. It'll be a quiet reconnection. A message sent late at night saying, "Can we talk?" A visit without cameras. An agreement to disagree, but still show up for a graduation or a dinner. Right now, the healing hasn't started. But there's a door. And whether Kody walks through it humbly or leaves it shut with more speeches about betrayal, that's what we're all watching to see. Because, despite everything, the people watching this story unfold don't want a fairy tale ending. They want a human one. One where the pain is acknowledged, where apologies aren't packaged as victimhood, where love isn't used as a leash, and where a father finally sees that reclaiming trust is not a right, it's a choice. One he still has the power to make, if he's willing to take the first step. Everything changed after the podcast. And not in the way Kody expected. He might have believed his words would bring clarity, maybe even pity, that people would finally see his side. Instead, it lit a match. Words meant to justify his pain only magnified everyone else's. And the ripple didn't stop at the kids. It moved through every part of the family, like a fault line, splitting what was already cracked too deep to hold. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was distance. A distance soaked in finality, where names still existed on paper, but roles had disappeared. The father, the partner, the leader. Titles once spoken as sacred were now rarely mentioned at all. And the footage, real episode snippets from this family trying to hold it together, tell a deeper story than anything he could ever say with a microphone. Christine in her new home, laughing with her girls, surrounded by ease that never existed around Kody. Janelle, standing strong but quiet, explaining the difference between peace and pretending. Gabe, still carrying the heaviness of being forgotten. Garrison, deciding not to wait for time that never shows up. The wives don't speak over each other anymore. They don't push smiles. They don't stretch themselves thin, trying to fit a mold that never loved them back the way they deserved. And under all of it, Robyn still reaches out, still begs for connection, still dreams of the restoration that's now a ghost in a house once full. But the footage tells the truth. The family isn't in a Cold War anymore. It's in the aftermath of something that might never be rebuilt. The couch interviews are quieter now, less defensive, sadder in places. You hear it in Meri's voice, the way she doesn't argue anymore. She's not trying to win. She's letting go without screaming, without pointing fingers. And maybe that's the most powerful break of all. Quiet exits where once there were confrontations. So what's left? A name, a history, a photo album with memories from birthday parties, baby dedications, road trips, and group photos where the smiles now feel bittersweet. But the future? It's changed. The family won't fit into one house, one table, one belief system. Not anymore. And that's not because they failed. It's because the ones who left finally chose truth over appearance, joy over guilt, honest pain over fake perfection. And the ones who remain will have to decide how much further they're willing to go to keep pretending. This isn't the ending fans were promised when this show began. It's not the conclusion of the dream TLC once sold us. But it's real. More real than it's ever been. And maybe that's the most compelling part. You can't script hearts breaking. You can't fake the moment a daughter gives up waiting for her dad to show up. And you can't rewrite the last word once it's been spoken publicly, for everyone, including the people you hurt, to hear. Still, something lingers in the silence. The chance, however small, for reflection, for personal ownership, for change that isn't filmed or posted or wrapped in spin. Something unspoken, waiting in the corners of all these goodbye moments. All it takes is one honest moment, one that doesn't come from blame or shame, but from humility. That kind of honesty hasn't shown up yet. But fans will keep watching, waiting, hoping, not for a reunion, but for truth, for something emotionally honest to pierce through the scripts and expectations. And maybe next time, someone will say the words that could have changed everything if they'd just come sooner. I'm sorry. Until then, the footage continues. The episodes keep airing, and the story moves forward. Messy, human, unresolved. Because next week, we see new sides, more fallout. Another child stepping back from the edge. Another decision being made, quietly but permanently. Because when the illusion ends, what's left isn't drama. It's real people figuring out how to live in the wreckage of what could have been. Tell me, if this was your family and your father said those things on a public stage, could you ever come back from that? Would you forgive? Would you forget? Or would you walk away, quietly, carrying love and heartbreak in equal measure? Let me know in the comments, because this story isn't over. Not yet.